Imani woke to sunlight pooling along the window like a promise she couldn't yet reach. Her world had shrunk to rooms and routines after the accident, but inside those walls her mind still wandered to the life she once imagined: laughter in crowded kitchens, music that rose without permission, and the small rebellions of ordinary days. She kept a stack of worn paperbacks and a stubborn hope tucked under her pillow, neither of which any of her attendants could entirely explain. On the street below, Jalen moved through the morning with a grin and a scavenger's grace, trading small favors and bright words for coins and smiles. He taught himself to find wonder in cracked pavement and to make strangers laugh until their faces changed. Laughter, he believed, was the nearest thing to magic. When he first saw Imani from across a park window, her hair wrapped like a crown, her wheelchair parked like quiet authority, something in him tilted. He didn't know who she was, only that she seemed sad in a way the world didn't know how to fix. Fate, as stubborn as both of them, arranged their meeting on a day the sky threatened tears. Jalen slipped into the building bringing a broken radio and a joke, and Imani found herself smiling at a boy who spoke as if the sun were his oldest friend. Their eyes met and the room, for the first time in many months, felt like it could hold more than sorrow. Neither understood yet how that small spark would grow into a light big enough to change everything around them. Jalen had a way with small things. He polished the radio until it sang again, tucked a fresh mango into Imani's lap with the theatricality of a seasoned performer, and told stories with the cadence of someone who'd learned to spin gold from nothing. Imani listened, astonished, because the stories didn't pity her. They invited her into rescue scenes where heroines could laugh and misbehave and still win. He described streets that hummed like orchestras and rooftops where broken dreams were patched into kites. Each tale sketched a world Imani had missed. As their afternoons lengthened, Imani taught Jalen to read the lines of old photographs and coaxed sleep into his restless shoulders with the steady, quiet rhythm only trust can build. He taught her to play a game of guessing songs by hums and to celebrate small victories. An email returned, a window opened, like fireworks. Together they made rituals that belonged to neither the staff nor the family. Tea at 3 when weather allowed, a daring escape to the garden bench when the guards were looking the other way. Word of their friendship threaded itself through the house. Some smiled indulgently, others watched with a polite curiosity reserved for new weather. Mr. Langston, who had steered the family's affairs with a steady, unreadable hand, noticed a change in his granddaughter's eyes. He'd not said much in years, but the spark he'd seen when Imani laughed with Jalen made him remember an old ache, one that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with missing joy. Imani discovered that hope wasn't a single thing but a collection of tiny rebellions: the courage to say "I'd like to try," the decision to paint a toe a ridiculous color, the willingness to let a stranger fold a song into your afternoon. Jalen nudged her toward these rebellions with the gentleness of someone who'd had to sneak happiness into his life for survival. He learned to steady her hands on the wheel, to guide it around corners she'd started to avoid, and each small success stitched a wider possibility into her days. Their connection deepened not through grand gestures but through the language of presence. Jalen's patient humming while Imani worked at a puzzle, Imani's quiet applause when Jalen coaxed a neighbor's dog into performing a ridiculous trick. Nights became a time for traded dreams. Imani confessed she'd once wanted to travel without maps. Jalen admitted he wanted, someday, to own a single room that smelled only of him, not survival. They imagined futures like children building forts, and in those forts the world outside softened at the edges. Mr. Langston watched these small revolutions as if cataloging them for a decision he had yet to name. He had long believed any problem could be solved with the right sum and a disciplined plan. Yet watching the way Imani lit up around Jalen, he felt the limits of numbers. There were joys that calculators could not reach, and he found himself listening more often at the door. A twist arrived the way sunlight sometimes does, sudden and ordinary. A storm knocked out the electricity one afternoon and the house, usually humming with the quiet orchestration of staff and schedules, fell soot silent. Candles were lit, someone played the piano softly, laughter leaked into halls like shared treasure. Without the hum of machines, conversations shifted to the simple, human level Mr. Langston had not visited in years. Imani and Jalen seized the hush and staged a small concert in the drawing room. Jalen's voice, raw and honest, and Imani's clap, steady as a drum. That evening became a story retold by staff and friends long after the lights returned. the scene of an heiress laughing until tears shone, the young street boy standing on a chair to reach a high note. It was the kind of thing that undid old armor and invited people to feel. Mr. Langston, listening from the doorway, felt a stare of memory open under his feet, memories of his own mother humming through crises, of a life when music had been the family's compass. He found himself, unaccountably, smiling through the ache. When the power came back, it was as if the house had been rearranged from the inside. People moved differently, spoke differently. Imani walked with a lighter cadence, her laugh now a regular instrument in the familiar symphony. Jalen and she had become not just companions but catalysts, and their influence began to ripple into decisions and conversations in rooms that had long been only about numbers and schedules. Rumors have a slow, polite way of becoming announcements. Staff members, once silent as trees, began to speak of visits Imani and Jalen made to small vendors, of the way they insisted on paying for things with gratitude rather than entitlement. They carried the kind of dignity that doesn't need headlines, it shows up in how someone meets another's eyes. For the first time in ages, the household felt less like a fortress and more like a place where human exchange mattered. Jalen's past remained a quiet shadow he refused to let define his present. He told Imani stories of nights sleeping under stars and the kindness of strangers who shared bread when bread was rare. Imani answered with memory-laden tales of lullabies she could hum from infancy, and together they found that vulnerability could be their greatest strength. They practiced saying thank you in neat, clear voices and learned to accept help with the awkward grace of people stepping into new roles. Mr. Langston, watching, felt the landscape of his responsibilities change. He had plans, vast, impressive plans, but he began to wonder if plans could sometimes be wrong for the heart. One evening he asked Jalen to stay for tea. The conversation was brief and full of unspoken understandings. After it, the man who had been known for his distance walked away with something like relief, as if a weight had been shifted onto firmer ground. Imani's doctors offered small, careful improvements, therapies that promised slow progress. She celebrated each one like a festival, a finger that twitched, a muscle that remembered its use. Jalen turned each milestone into a private holiday. He'd decorate the room with paper cranes or sing silly songs while she tried new exercises, turning fear into something manageable. Progress was not linear, but their patience was a steady drumbeat that made the hard days tolerable and the good days breathtaking. Neighbors began to notice changes too, the way Imani smiled at passers-by, how she leaned forward to listen rather than withdraw. Jalen's influence was not just in the laughter he brought but in the way he made life feel possible again. He urged Imani to write notes to herself, little reminders of triumphs she could reread on darker mornings. She scribbled them in uneven handwriting that later became a book of small victories. Their rituals threaded into the household's daily tapestry until the air itself felt kinder. Outside the garden walls, the world whispered its usual curiosities, and Mr. Langston found himself answering questions he once deflected. He had followed rules to maintain an image, now he found image less important than truth. The truth, which included Jalen's stubborn tenderness and Imani's fierce, quiet courage, demanded a response that could not be papered over by appearances. Something in the family ledger shifted when Mr. Langston began to attend to things he'd neglected. A photograph he'd forgotten to hang, a letter he'd never mailed, a promise he'd meant to keep. He started to join Imani and Jalen for tea more often, listening to their plans with a curiosity that felt almost adolescent. Those plans were simple: open the big windows more, plant a citrus tree in the courtyard, host an evening where stories were exchanged without pretense, and they were revolutionary in their smallness. Jalen taught Imani to whistle with 2 fingers and she taught him how to press his palm flat against a piano key and feel the vibration run up like a secret. The household staff, touched by the couple's insistence on ordinary joy, began to bring their own small treasures: a spice from a vendor, a cassette tape of an old love song, a packet of seeds. The house began to collect these small affections until it felt like the home it had once pretended to be. For the first time in years, Mr. Langston took a walk without an agenda. He walked with the slow attentiveness of someone rediscovering his city and, in the space between one foot and the next, he realized something plain and radical: wealth had given him choices, and perhaps it was time to choose differently. That thought lodged in him like a seed in soil, and it started to grow. An invitation arrived. A small dinner with a handful of friends and colleagues, nothing more than a chance to share a meal and maybe a story. Mr. Langston surprised everyone by asking that Jalen sit at the table as his guest of honor. Staff exchanged glances, the household buzzed like a hive, but the act was simple and sincere, and it shifted something wider than any one evening. Jalen, nervous but radiant, spoke of hope in the understated language he used for everything: soft, persuasive, true. Conversations meandered from books to music to small confessions. People who had never spoken kindly to one another revisited their manners and truths. Imani, radiant in a quiet way that required no embellishment, told a story about a childhood kite that refused to fly until it learned to trust the wind. The room laughed and listened as if it had been waiting its whole life for permission to be human. That night, Mr. Langston sat back and watched the scene play like a film he hadn't expected to love. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that influence could be used to broaden joy rather than to sculpt a legacy of prestige. The revelation, while gentle, had the power to upend a life built on carefully maintained distance. News travels oddly, not by headlines but by hearthside chatter, by a gardener who tells a baker who tells a cab driver. The household's quiet reinvention started to draw attention the way sunlight draws moths. People wondered what had changed, and why. Critics murmured, admirers whispered, and somewhere beyond polite curiosity someone began to stitch a narrative that would blossom into public interest. Mr. Langston, who'd long managed perceptions, found himself both amused and unsettled. He surprised everyone by responding to the curiosity with transparency. He invited conversation rather than hiding behind statements. He spoke about the small, undeniable thing that had altered his course: watching his granddaughter find laughter and purpose in the company of a young man who refused to let life's hardships make him hard. People listened, and in listening, they felt permission to hope. The surprise was not that Mr. Langston had a change of heart but that he articulated it openly, like someone who had learned that truth might be more persuasive than reputation. Meanwhile, Jalen and Imani navigated newfound attention with an awkward sweetness. They were not used to being watched, they were used to living. But they found grace in one another, in the way small hands fit and small jokes landed, and they kept returning to what mattered most: living each day fully, tenderly, honestly. Pressure arrived in the predictable way pressure does, through offers, opinions, and invitations that smelled like new demands. Some wanted to turn Imani's story into polished narratives or to place Jalen on stages that required him to become performance rather than presence. Mr. Langston recognized the rhythms of leverage and paused, refusing to let his granddaughter's life become another headline. He met the swirling interest with a calm that surprised even himself. Imani and Jalen felt the pressure and, together, decided what they would concede and what they would protect. They kept the parts of their lives that were private and shared the parts that were generous. They refused to let their narrative be co-opted by others who wanted drama over dignity. The choice was not grand, it was the modest, stubborn act of saying no to anyone who confused spectacle for meaning. That firmness drew admiration and criticism in unequal measures. Some labeled Mr. Langston eccentric, others called him wise. He made decisions that stunned many. He declined flashy interviews, he authorized small community events that were intimate rather than ostentatious, and he began to reallocate his time in a way that bewildered the boardrooms he'd once frequented. The world watched, increasingly perplexed by a billionaire who seemed bent on rediscovering how to be human. One quiet morning, Mr. Langston called Imani and Jalen to his study. The air hummed with the gravity of what might come, promises fulfilled or closed doors. He spoke without flourish, telling them that he had been thinking about legacy not as an accumulation of wealth but as the capacity to leave spaces where people could belong. He surprised them further by announcing he would step back from certain public roles, an action that sent ripples through the circles that kept tabs on his life. "It's time," he said simply, "to trust you both." The words landed like an offering. He proposed they take stewardship of a small estate project he'd quietly kept for years, a place where people could gather, learn, and feel seen. He emphasized trust over instruction, generosity over spectacle, and offered guidance rather than control. Imani and Jalen, stunned and honored, accepted with the mixture of joy and fear that accompanies every meaningful step forward. Their acceptance didn't come with fanfare or press releases, it came with quiet planning and honest conversations. They argued, they laughed, they rewrote plans until the documents felt like extensions of their lives. The house breathed easier, as if relieved to pass something delicate into hands that would treat it kindly. As they stepped into their new roles, Imani and Jalen discovered that leadership required patience and the humility to ask for help. They learned to balance hope with realism, to design days that honored both ambition and rest. Jalen, who once survived on instinct, learned calendars and meetings. Imani, who had been cautious by necessity, found her voice in decisions that shaped other people's days. Together they modeled a new kind of stewardship, one built on empathy, not image. They encountered setbacks, of course, a supplier who misunderstood their vision, a beloved program that needed reworking, a fallow patch of land that resisted planting. Each challenge demanded collaboration and sometimes surrender. But they met them with the same steady tenderness that had knit their early days, patience, laughter, and the willingness to begin again. Their partnership matured into a rhythm of complementary strengths, Jalen's improvisational courage balanced by Imani's careful tenacity. Mr. Langston watched them grow with a pride that felt free of possessiveness. He had given them a surprising gift, space to fail, to learn, and to thrive. The world watched too, and slowly, the surprise began to soften into admiration. The billionaire had stepped aside not for spectacle but for love, and the hearts at the center of the story were steady, resilient, and very, very human. The world did, in fact, notice when Imani and Jalen opened their place to the public, not with fanfare but with a simple invitation, "Come as you are." People arrived with curiosities and burdens and left with the lightness that comes from being truly seen. The team they built reflected their values: honest, warm individuals who believed in small dignities. The couple hosted evenings of story exchange, music sessions where anyone could play, and quiet workshops that taught practical skills alongside the art of listening. Imani's mobility improved incrementally. She learned to navigate stairs with devices that gave her balance and confidence. Jalen continued to surprise her and everyone else. He cultivated a rooftop garden that fed staff lunches and inspired neighbors. He taught children how to build simple instruments from recycled parts and showed adults how to find song in spans of silence. Their life together was a testament to the power of ordinary compassion applied consistently. Then came the announcement that truly surprised the world. Mr. Langston relinquished public control of a few of his enterprises, not as a resignation but as a redistribution of stewardship to people he trusted, beginning with Imani and Jalen. The media, predictably, made headlines and conjectures, but those closest knew the quiet truth. It was a decision made from the deep knowledge that legacy can be about expanding joy, and that the bravest move a person of means can make is to trust others with power. The final chapter did not end in fireworks but in a sunrise. Imani and Jalen stood on their rooftop, the city's hum a distant rhythm, and looked at the life they had fashioned from fragile beginnings. They had learned to manage attention, to hold boundaries, and to love with a curiosity that never hardened. Their days were full, sometimes chaotic, sometimes blissfully ordinary, and always shared. They grew, separately and together, into versions of themselves that earlier lives had only hinted at. Mr. Langston attended their small celebration not as a guest of honor but as a delighted grandfather, his eyes soft with a peace he had not thought possible in his youth. He had surprised the world, perhaps, with his gestures, but the truest surprise was quieter, a man realizing the deepest value of life was not accumulation but connection. The headlines would tell one story, the people who lived it knew another. In the end, hope proved to be less a miracle than a habit. Jalen's laughter remained a compass, Imani's courage became a steady drumbeat, and Mr. Langston's last great move was not an edict but an offering, a choice to trust love over image, human flourishing over spectacle. The world, surprised for a moment, watched as a street boy, a paralyzed heiress, and a billionaire rewrote what it meant to belong, proving that sometimes the most radical act is simply to give someone the space to flourish.